The company party was packed, a constant buzz of conversation, laughter, and toasts echoing through the brightly lit hall. I watched her from afar, like so many other times, laughing at something he said, leaning too close, too intimate. A knot was forming in my stomach. It wasn't just discomfort, it wasn't paranoia, it was the cold, implacable certainty that something was wrong. When they left together, without even bothering to hide it, I felt my world fall apart. What happened that night was something I never imagined experiencing. It was humiliation turned into reality, betrayal tearing my soul to pieces. The woman who promised to be my forever partner was walking out the door with another man, and all I could think about was how it had all come to this. When I got home, anger and hurt pride took over. There were no tears, no screams of despair. There was only the piercing silence of someone who had already decided that he would not be reduced to a shadow. I took a pen and paper, wrote the divorce letter with a firm hand, as if each word were a weapon aimed at the pain. I knew she would come back, I knew that, at some point, I would realize that the glow of a forbidden adventure did not sustain a life. But at that moment, I had already made up my mind. When the door opened in the early hours of the morning and I saw her standing there, surprised to find me awake, I placed the letter in her hands. "Leah," he said, cold as ice. What followed was a chaotic mix of apologies, tears, and empty promises. She read the letter and, for the first time, seemed to understand the depth of what she had done. The lover was no longer relevant. He, who hid in the shadow of his lies, now faced the possibility of losing everything too. They thought they could continue with their games, that the betrayal would be a passing storm, but they were about to learn that some actions have consequences that no one can avoid. I was not passive. I gathered evidence, showed the world the truth they tried to hide. It wasn't just the emotional betrayal that devastated me, but the fact that I gave myself completely, that I was transparent in a relationship where she was a broken mirror. The lover, a close colleague, not only betrayed trust in the marriage but also compromised professional trust. When it all came to light, the impact was devastating. They faced judgment in the hallways at work, in the whispers of meetings, in the eyes of colleagues who now saw them for who they really were. As I watched them wallow in the consequences of their own actions, something inside me began to shift. The pain didn't disappear immediately, but it gave way to a clarity I hadn't expected. The love I once felt for her couldn't simply be erased, but it also couldn't survive the destruction she brought. And there, deep in my own despair, I began to find the strength to start over. They, on the other hand, were trapped in a net they had woven for themselves. The lover, who seemed so confident, now had to deal with the repercussions of his choices. The wife, who had justified herself with empty words, now faced the isolation that had previously been my burden. There was no more room for late regrets or half-baked excuses. They had crossed a line, and on the other side, they found the emptiness that remained after destroying a life. But what did she see in my letter? Why did that, of all the things that could have shattered her world, send her into such absolute despair? Maybe it was the firm, final tone I adopted, or maybe it was something more, something she hadn't expected. The words I wrote in that letter were not just goodbye, they were a mirror of the truth she didn't want to face. And now, as I look to the future, I still feel the pulsing pain of betrayal, but I also realize that there is something more beyond this story. Something that cannot be erased, but can be rewritten. As she holds the letter, tears streaming down her face, and he stares at the emptiness left by his actions, I wonder, do they still think it was worth it? What would she do to go back, and what would he sacrifice to undo the irreparable? And most of all, how did I turn what seemed like the end into an unexpected beginning? Welcome to the channel where we reveal the darkest side of human relationships. Here, betrayal is never glorified, on the contrary, we show how it destroys lives, families and trust. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they carry a powerful lesson about the real consequences of wrong choices. Get ready to dive into an intense narrative, full of twists and emotions that will leave you breathless. We wish you a good story, and hold on tight, because the shock is just beginning. The ballroom was elegantly decorated, a perfect reflection of the successful image that Daniel and Laura cultivated. He, a respected executive at a technology multinational, was known for his firm stance and discreet way of commanding. She, a woman with a captivating smile, had conquered her space in an area that required both intelligence and charm, marketing. Together, they formed the type of couple that everyone admired. For many, they were the personification of a balanced life, a stable marriage that resisted time and the challenges of routine. But, as is often the case, the surface rarely reflects what is hidden beneath. Daniel had a strict routine, divided between intense work and moments carefully reserved for his family. He was not a man of many words, but he showed his love in practical ways. Little notes left on the bathroom mirror, messages during the day asking how Laura's work was going, or even the nights when he arrived exhausted, but still insisted on helping her tidy up the kitchen. These were their ways of saying, "I love you." Laura, on the other hand, had an outgoing personality. He enjoyed long conversations, dinners with friends and, especially, the annual trips they took together. But lately, there was something different about the way she smiled at Daniel. He noticed it, but couldn't say what it was. Maybe it was just accumulated tiredness or the inevitable ups and downs of a long relationship. The house where they lived was a portrait of the stability they had built over the years. A comfortable townhouse in a quiet neighborhood, decorated with modern furniture that blended both tastes. In the garden, the flowers that Laura personally took care of gave life to the space, while Daniel was busy keeping the lawn immaculate. It was the kind of place that looked like it came out of a catalog, but carried the personal touch of their shared memories. The laughter on game nights, the discussions about which series to watch, the comfortable silences on the couch while everyone read something different. Everything there seemed to indicate that they were well, that they were happy. However, apparent perfection is never that simple. Laura, who was always the center of attention at any social event, began spending more time at the office. He claimed urgent projects, campaigns that required extra dedication. Daniel, busy with his own demands, accepted the justifications without question, although he missed the quiet nights when they had dinner together without rushing. He believed that their efforts were an investment for the future, but an unsettling feeling sometimes invaded him. There were nights when he would wake up in the middle of the night and see her side of the bed empty. When I confronted her, she would just say that she couldn't sleep and was working in the office. Laura, in turn, had a unique ability to transition between different roles. She was an exemplary professional, a loyal friend and a partner who knew how to make Daniel feel special. But lately, there was a growing tension in her posture, something she couldn't completely hide. Maybe it was the weight of expectations, or maybe it was something deeper, something that even she herself couldn't define. She spent hours reflecting on her life, trying to understand if she was still the woman Daniel knew and loved, or if she had changed so much that not even he could recognize her anymore. The couple's friends also noticed the nuances of this change, but no one dared to comment. At meetings and dinners, Daniel maintained his usual posture, smiling and participating in conversations without giving anything more than was necessary. Laura was more effusive, but her responses sometimes seemed rehearsed, as if she were avoiding some sensitive topic. There was a weight in the looks they exchanged, a type of silent communication that only those who have lived together for many years can understand. But, even with all these nuances, what prevailed was the image they projected, a solid, unshakable couple. At work, Daniel had the respect of his colleagues and subordinates, but he also had a reputation for being demanding. He believed that success came from continuous effort and was willing to sacrifice nights and weekends to ensure his team delivered their best. Laura, on the other hand, had a lighter, more charming style. She was the kind of person who knew everyone's name in the office, who offered advice with a disarming ease. This difference in styles has never been a problem for them, on the contrary, it always seemed to be the force that held them together. But over time, even strengths can become weaknesses. In the weeks leading up to the company party, Laura seemed even more distant. Daniel tried not to pressure her, believing that the best thing to do was to give her space. He focused on his own demands, on a large project he was nearing completion. When the night of the party arrived, he was exhausted, but he insisted on accompanying her. It was an annual tradition, something he knew meant a lot to her. He watched her get ready, admiring how, even after so many years, she still managed to impress him with her beauty. But there was something in her eyes, a gleam he couldn't decipher. When they arrived at the event, everything seemed normal. They greeted acquaintances, participated in small talk and toasted the success of the year. But as the night wore on, Daniel noticed something different. Laura was more excited than usual, laughing loudly, gesturing enthusiastically. He couldn't decide if this was a good thing or a worrying thing. As she moved around the room, he watched her from a distance, feeling increasingly disconnected. There was a void between them that he didn't know how to fill. And it was in this void that everything began to transform. That night had started like so many others, but Daniel couldn't ignore the restlessness that grew in his chest. After years of living together, he knew how to recognize the small signs in Laura. Their laughter, which had previously sounded genuine, now seemed like a performance. His responses were automatic, calculated, as if each word was chosen carefully so as not to reveal something bigger. He tried to convince himself that it was just tiredness that made him imagine things. After all, it wasn't the first time that a long period of intense work had created a certain distance between them. However, what he realized that night at the party was different. Laura was radiant, but her enthusiasm was not for him. As she chatted with her colleagues, she seemed almost untouchable, as if she were in another world, far from the man who had spent the last few years by her side. Daniel, on the other hand, maintained his calm and reserved posture, observing her gestures like a silent spectator. It was unusual behavior for him, who was normally concerned with socializing and keeping up appearances. But something was stopping him from getting involved, as if his intuition was warning him of an invisible danger. When Laura went away to talk to some acquaintances, Daniel remained in the corner of the room, his gaze wandering through the crowd until he found her again. She was near a lively group, but her attention seemed focused on just one person. He couldn't hear what was said, but the gestures were unmistakable. Subtle inclinations, casual touches, a smile she'd never given him like that again. It was the kind of silent communication that Daniel never thought he would need to decipher, but which now made him feel an oppressive weight in his chest. The loud music and conversations around him made it impossible to think clearly, but he knew he wasn't wrong. Laura had always been outgoing, but this was different. There was a familiarity in the way she carried herself around this man that he had never seen before. The stranger, tall and confident, seemed to absorb all of her attention, as if no one else in the room existed. Daniel tried to push the thoughts away, telling himself it was just an innocent interaction, but a part of him no longer believed it. When the party reached its peak, with toasts and speeches, Daniel saw Laura and the man disappearing together down the corridor that led to the terrace. His mind wavered between the desire to follow them and hesitation, as if, upon confirming his suspicions, something inside him would break forever. He took a deep breath, seeking courage, but at the same time feeling the weight of what he might find. Every step I took toward the hallway seemed to take an eternity. His heart was beating wildly, and his mind was already starting to construct scenarios that he preferred not to imagine. On the terrace, the night was cold, and the wind carried fragments of voices. Daniel heard muffled laughter before spotting the two. They were leaning against the wall, too close, talking in a way that made it clear that they weren't just colleagues or acquaintances. He hid in the shadows, not having the courage to interrupt the moment, but unable to look away. Her every laugh sounded like a stab, every movement seemed to confirm what he feared. And when he finally saw the man put his hand on Laura's face, leaning in to kiss her, reality set in with crushing force. He returned to the hall in silence, his mind filled with a whirlwind of emotions. There was no way he could face Laura at that moment without exploding into a confrontation he knew he wouldn't be able to control. Instead, he left the party without looking back, walking through the empty streets as he tried to process what he had just witnessed. Every memory that came to light seemed like a cruel irony, the promises made, the plans made, the nights when he believed they were together for the same purpose. Everything now seemed like a distant echo of something that had never been real. At home, he sat on the couch for hours, staring into space. There were no tears, just a feeling of emptiness and betrayal that he never thought possible. The words to describe what I felt didn't come. It was as if his mind had closed itself off, protecting him from the full impact of the pain. But one thing was clear, nothing would be the same as before. When Laura arrived hours later, her smile disappeared as soon as she saw Daniel sitting in the living room, motionless. She tried to act naturally, but his silence was different, filled with something she still couldn't decipher. He didn't ask anything, he didn't confront. He just watched as she walked up the stairs, as if that were the end of a play he hadn't chosen to watch. Daniel knew he needed to act, but he still didn't know how. What he would do, however, was clear: he would no longer be a spectator in his own life. The silence in the house was filled with an almost palpable tension. Laura was in the kitchen, stirring the coffee with a mechanical movement, trying to ignore Daniel's presence in the room. He was sitting in the armchair, motionless, holding a sheet of paper in his hand. His eyes were fixed on one point, but his mind was elsewhere, reliving every detail of that night and the days that followed. The weight of what he had discovered was so crushing that he felt as if he couldn't breathe. Finally, he broke the silence. Laura, upon hearing her name, stopped her movement and raised her eyes, hesitantly. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a firmness that made her shiver. He was holding an envelope, the same one she had seen on the table that morning, but which she hadn't had the courage to open. Before she could say anything, Daniel slowly stood up, crossing the room towards her. He placed the envelope on the counter, next to her mug, and spoke with a calm that sounded even scarier than shouting. "Read. Just that. Read now." Laura hesitated, but the intensity in Daniel's gaze made her take the envelope with trembling hands. She opened it slowly, as if the contents might explode in her hands. When his eyes met the words on the paper, his face lost color. It was a formal declaration of divorce, but she expected that. What left her paralyzed was the second sheet, which contained a detailed investigation, a chronology of events that Laura knew were impossible to deny. Daniel watched her. He no longer looked like the man she knew. He was someone completely transformed by pain and the need to understand how they got there. He finally broke the silence again, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to suffocate it. "I saw you that night. I saw everything. You didn't even bother to disguise it. But that's not all. I followed, Laura. I needed to understand who he was. You needed to know what he wanted from you. Because honestly, I couldn't believe you just threw all that away for no better reason." Laura tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His throat felt dry, and his eyes, now teary, desperately searched for a way to relieve the tension. Daniel continued, his tone increasingly charged with emotion. "I looked for him. You knew he had another family, didn't you? That he has a wife and children? Did you know that while he was with me, he was destroying other people's lives too? Or did you just not care?" Laura shook her head, trying to deny it, but Daniel's voice rose for the first time. "Don't lie to me now. You knew. Because he used you, Laura. And you left." She began to cry, a low sob that grew louder until it took over the room. "I didn't know, Daniel. I swear I didn't know he had another family. I thought he was different. That he really loved me. That we had something, real." Daniel laughed, but it wasn't a humorous laugh. It was bitter, full of disbelief. "Real? Did you think it was real? And me? What did we have? Wasn't this real? I worked all these years, I made sacrifices, I loved you in every way I knew how. And you threw it all away for someone who lied to you. Who lied to everyone." Laura sank to the ground, unable to support herself. Daniel walked away, running his hands through his hair, as if he desperately needed to find some control in the chaos. He walked to the window, looking at the garden he tended himself. That space that, for so long, was a symbol of the life they built together, now seemed empty. He took a deep breath before continuing, his voice low, almost a whisper. I met his wife. I went to her. I told everything. She looked at me like her world had ended, and all I could think was the same look I had that night. And you know what's most ironic? I felt sorry for her. Because deep down, I knew exactly how she felt. Laura looked at him, her face streaked with tears. Daniel, I know I have no excuses. I know what I did was wrong. I know I hurt you in a way that I may never be able to fix. But I still love you. I know it doesn't seem like it, I know it doesn't make sense, but it's true. I still love you. Daniel turned to face her, his eyes cold and steady. No. You don't love me. Because those who love don't do that. Those who love don't destroy like that. And you know what's saddest? I loved you in a way that I will never be able to love anyone else. And you killed it. Silence took over the house again, but now it was even heavier. Daniel sat back down, exhausted, while Laura remained on the floor, a reflection of the devastation she herself had caused. The only thing that remained was the truth, naked and raw, and the consequences that would follow. And for the first time, Laura realized that perhaps what she feared most was not losing Daniel, but rather facing herself in the mirror and accepting the woman she had become. Daniel stood up abruptly and walked to the kitchen door. The tension in the environment was almost suffocating, and the silence only made the words from minutes ago echo with more force. He took a deep breath, looking at the garden through the window, while his hands shook slightly, still holding the paper containing the divorce declaration. He knew he needed to continue, but each word seemed to weigh like a stone. Laura remained on the floor, motionless, as if her own strength had been drained by the conversation. She raised her eyes, watching Daniel's back, and ventured an almost inaudible tone of voice. You went to her, didn't you? Even his wife. I don't know what to say about that. I don't know how you did it. Daniel turned slowly, cold eyes meeting hers. Of course I went. Do you think it would be easy for me to ignore the fact that you destroyed our marriage for someone who destroyed hers too? No. I needed to look her in the eye. I needed to understand if I was the only idiot here, or if we were all pieces in the same game. Laura tried to get up, leaning on the counter, but her legs seemed too weak to support her. Daniel continued to stand still, his arms crossed, his posture rigid. He seemed like a wall, insurmountable, and increasingly distant from the man she knew. What she had never imagined was how he would react when the truth came out. Now that everything was exposed, she felt naked, vulnerable, without any argument that could alleviate the situation. She began to walk around the kitchen, her steps small and uncertain. I know it's impossible to ask you for anything right now. But, what happened when you talked to her? How did she react? Daniel let out a short, bitter laugh. Do you want details? Do you want to know how she looked at me as if I were the messenger of destruction? She didn't scream, Laura. He didn't cry. He just asked if it was true. And when I confirmed, she thanked me. She thanked me, because now she could move forward, without living in doubt. He paused, eyes fixed on her. Maybe I should thank you too, because, in a way, you did the same for me. Laura approached slowly, her eyes begging for a crumb of understanding. Daniel, please don't say that. I was wrong, yes, but that doesn't mean it was all a lie. We built a life together. That means something. You mean something. He shook his head, a bitter smile on his lips. Does it mean? Maybe it has meaning. But now, looking at you, at what we've become, I don't know what was real anymore. And that, Laura, is what hurts the most. She tried to touch him, but he recoiled, as if her touch was something he couldn't bear. "Don't do that, Laura. Don't try to fix what you destroyed with words. Words won't change anything. They will not bring back trust, respect, love. Because this, all of this, you gave to another man, and he threw it away as if it were worthless." Laura stepped back, shocked by the intensity of his tone. She had never seen him like this. He was always so calm, so balanced. But now, it was as if all the accumulated pain and anger were boiling over at once. Daniel took the divorce letter from the counter and placed it on the living room table, before turning to face her again. "I'm not going to keep living like this, Laura. I can't. I deserve more than this. And you should also ask yourself why you did what you did. There's no point trying to justify it. You weren't just cheating on me. You were betraying yourself, the idea of who you wanted to be. And now, all that's left are the consequences." Laura finally managed to speak, her voice broken by tears. "And what do you want me to do, Daniel? That I just accept that you're leaving, that everything is over?" He responded with a firm tone, but without shouting. "No, Laura. I want you to face what you did. I want you to look in the mirror and see the person you chose to be. Because I'm going to do it. I will rebuild myself, and I will find someone who sees me for who I am, and not as something disposable." She fell to the floor again, tears flowing freely. "Please, Daniel, don't do that. It doesn't say that. I can't imagine my life without you." He sighed deeply, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the decision he had already made. "It's not up to me to carry this anymore, Laura. I carried our marriage for a long time. Now, it's your turn to deal with what's left." Without another word, Daniel turned and went to the bedroom, picking up a suitcase that he had already packed. As he walked past Laura, she tried to grab his arm, but he just moved away with a slight movement, without even looking back. When he opened the door and walked out, the silence that was left behind was deafening, and Laura knew, in that moment, that something inside her had broken forever. When the door closed behind Daniel, the sound echoed through the house like an end to the story Laura never wanted to end. She lay still, staring at the ground, unable to fully process what had just happened. The emptiness in the room seemed to swallow her, and the silence was almost unbearable. Laura tried to get up, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. Finally, with effort, she managed to reach the table, where the divorce letter was still resting. His eyes, blurred by tears, ran over the words once again, as if trying to understand them might change what they meant. Every sentence on that paper carried an unbearable weight. They weren't just nice words, they were confirmation that his world was falling apart. Laura tried to remember how she got here, how she allowed her life to spiral out of control in such an irreversible way. But all the justifications she had used for herself before now seemed empty. She hated herself for her weakness, for her foolishness, for having believed in something that should never have been allowed to exist. As she walked through the house, feeling like a stranger in her own home, memories began to flash back to her. The happy moments she and Daniel shared, the nights of laughter and complicity, the little traditions they created over the years. All of this now seemed distant, as if it belonged to another life. Every memory, however sweet, was now an open wound, a cruel reminder of what she had lost. The phone rang, breaking the oppressive silence. For a moment, Laura hesitated to answer, fearing it was Daniel, even though she knew he probably wouldn't call. When he finally answered, his voice was fragile. On the other end of the line, a female voice greeted her, cold and direct. It was the lover's wife. The words that followed were filled with pain and fury, each sentence cutting like a blade. Laura tried to respond, but realized she had no arguments. The weight of the betrayal was too great, and the woman's words were just a confirmation of something she already knew: no one came out unscathed from something like this. After the call, Laura felt a new wave of despair. She knew there was no escaping the consequences of her actions, but facing them seemed like a monumental task. She spent the night wandering around the house, trying to find some way to fix what she had broken, but reality was relentless. There was no easy solution, there was no going back. All she could do was stare at the wreckage and try to figure out how to rebuild something from it. Meanwhile, Daniel drove aimlessly, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The initial anger he had felt when leaving home was now giving way to a deep emptiness. He had imagined this moment so many times since discovering the betrayal, but nothing prepared him for the reality. Even with the decision made, there was a part of him that still clung to the idea of what could have been. He wondered where everything had started to go wrong, if there was anything he could have done to avoid getting to this point. He stopped at a motel on the road, the kind of place he would never imagine going to. The room was small and impersonal, but it offered the isolation he needed. Sitting on the bed, Daniel finally allowed the tears to come. It wasn't just about the betrayal, but about everything he felt he had lost, the years that couldn't be regained, the love he believed was unwavering, the trust that now seemed a distant concept. He knew that somehow he would need to move on, but at that moment all he wanted was to escape the pain. Laura spent the next few days in a daze. She tried calling Daniel, but the calls went straight to voicemail. She wrote messages she never sent, words that sounded empty even to her. With each passing day, his absence seemed more definitive, as if he were disappearing from your life. The nights were the worst, with the silence of the house amplifying his loneliness. She found herself walking through the rooms, touching the objects he had left behind, as if she could find some trace of him in them. At the same time, Daniel began to rebuild his routine, even though each day felt like a struggle. He found solace in small things, a walk in the park, a casual conversation with a stranger, moments of silence that weren't filled with painful memories. He knew the road would be long, but he was determined to find a new version of himself, someone who could live beyond the pain. The distance between them grew every day, but for both of them there was a feeling that something had not yet been completely resolved. There were questions that needed to be faced, truths that had not yet been fully told. And while everyone followed their own path, the shadow of the past hung over them, waiting for the right moment to be confronted. Time passed, and what was left between Daniel and Laura was a distant echo of everything they had once been. Laura remained in the house, a lonely presence in a place that now seemed empty, almost like a mausoleum of memories. The nights were long, and the days were purposeless. She tried to get back to her routine, but every gesture seemed meaningless. The constant silence was a cruel reminder of her choices, and Daniel's absence filled every space. Days became weeks, and weeks became months. Every day, she felt more of the weight of what she had lost. Daniel, for his part, was determined not to be defined by what happened. He sold the house, cleaned up the traces of the past and moved on to a new city, a new beginning. It was a small place, where no one knew its history. He found work at a smaller company, something that wasn't as demanding on his already exhausted mind. Little by little, he began to rebuild his life, but there were still nights when the pain returned with a vengeance. He wondered if he would ever be able to trust again, if he would be able to love another person without carrying the weight of what he had experienced. One afternoon, while walking through a park, Daniel came across a woman reading on a bench. She seemed oblivious to the world, completely immersed in the book in her hands. He hesitated for a moment before sitting down on the next bench, and the two began to talk. It was not an immediate and magical encounter, but something more subtle, built over time. She had a calm, almost therapeutic manner that contrasted with the intensity of her recent emotions. For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt like there was hope, that maybe he could find peace in someone else. Laura, on the other hand, decided she needed to face her mistakes head-on. She sought therapy, something she had avoided for fear of confronting her own guilt. The sessions were painful but necessary. She began to understand that her betrayal was not just a failure in her marriage, but a failure with herself. Little by little, she began to work on rebuilding her identity, discovering who she was without the validation of another man, without the excuses she had made for herself. There were days when she felt strong, capable of moving forward, but there were also moments when everything seemed impossible. The lover, who had promised so much, faced his own consequences. The revelation of his affair destroyed his professional and personal reputation. His wife filed for divorce, taking the children with her. He tried to rebuild his life, but the trail of destruction he left behind haunted him. Now, alone in a small apartment, he questioned whether the choices he made were worth it. The response, whenever it came, was crushing silence. Daniel and Laura met one last time, months later, at a cafe where they used to go together. It was an unexpected meeting, but it no longer carried the tension of the past. It was as if they both accepted that they couldn't change what happened, but they could move on in different ways. Laura apologized again, not as an attempt to win Daniel back, but as a way to ease her own conscience. He accepted her words, but made it clear that they would not change the course he had chosen for his life. When they said goodbye, Daniel realized that he was finally free from the weight he was carrying. Laura, in turn, felt that although she could never undo what she did, she could at least try to be a better person. Each one followed their path, stronger and more aware of themselves. For Daniel, the future was a blank canvas, full of possibilities. For Laura, it was a long and lonely but necessary journey. Now, we want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Share your opinion in the comments, say what caught your attention the most and how you see the impact of each character's choices. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Always remember that this channel does not support, under any circumstances, any type of betrayal. The stories told here are fictional and bring an important lesson. Our choices have consequences, and trust, once destroyed, is almost impossible to rebuild. Until the next story.